All right, I guess we should get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the High Energy Seminars. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we are going to be hearing from Kelsie Krafton about science and space policy in the current era. This is a bit of a special talk. The talk will go on for the whole hour as opposed to half an hour. So Kelsie is the AAS John and Bacall Public Policy Fellow. She has been the fellow since July 2019. Before that, she received her PhD in physics from Louisiana State University, and she worked with Jeff Clayton on dust formation by supernovae. She's eventually looking to pursue a career in STEM education policy. At the current moment, she mostly works on advocacy for science funding, the satellite constellation issue, and measuring the impact the pandemic has had on AAS members. So Kelsie, thank you very much for joining us. I was mentioning earlier that she agreed to give this talk at pretty short notice, so thanks again for that, and take it away.
Thank you for inviting me. So I'm the Bacall Public Policy Fellow for the AAS, which means I make up a whole half of the public policy staff at the AAS. Also joining me in the department is Joel Perriott, the Public Policy Director. And it's our job to basically act as a two-way communication channel between the professional astronomical science community and the government. So there's this misconception that scientists and the science they do is all that's just kind of happening in this science bubble that's separate from the rest of society. There's that ivory tower idea, but I think most people at this point know that's not true. And everything that we're doing is against this backdrop. And a big part of that backdrop is what is happening politically around us, globally, in our country, in our state, in our district. And I have some examples of how government actions impact our ability to do science. So the big one, which we deal with a lot in science advocacy, is budgets. And sometimes entire offices at NASA get eliminated in budgets, and that's a big deal. Another way that the government can impact scientists is through regulation. So something that's completely independent of the budget process, but is very much regulated, is the sharing of spectrum. So mostly in the past, that's dealt with the radio part of the spectrum, but now with the satellite constellation problem, we're starting to have to deal with sharing the optical and infrared part of the spectrum. Other forms of regulation can and legal actions taken by the government outside of just the budget process include authorizations. So all the agencies have to be authorized by Congress, and then they keep getting reauthorized about every few years, usually not on an annual basis, but a little bit longer time scale than that. And whenever an agency gets reauthorized, the priorities of that agency get to be reevaluated by Congress. Generally, anything that was in the decadal survey is going to stick in every reauthorization, but other projects, Congress might direct the agency to put their attention on that project specifically or turn their attention elsewhere. So right now, NSF, DOE's Office of Science, NASA, and NIST are all up for reauthorization. And then maybe not through Congress, but through the administration, we can be impacted through executive orders. And that's when the president basically gets to just declare something the law, but with more restrictions than Congress's power. And so recently we've been dealing with executive orders on visas that have impacted our international students. So some policymakers I'm going to be mentioning a lot during this presentation are the White House. I might also refer to it as the administration. So that includes the president, the vice president, and everyone who works directly for them. So that's actually a lot of people. Couple different groups that I might mention specifically are the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Office of Management and Budget. So OSTP, the first one, it's their job to kind of translate the president's vision of America's science goals into a more tangible policy direction for the nation. And then that is made real by the agencies. And then the Office of Management and Budget basically controls the budget, but not really, because Congress gets the last say, and Office of Management and Budget, also known as OMB, works for the administration. So they basically spend all year working with the agencies on their budget plans, which then if Congress decides they want something else to happen, then the agencies have to scramble to redo their plans, which has been happening a lot in this administration. Then we have our elected representatives. So at the federal level, these are our House of Representatives and Senate and Congress. You can also have your elected representatives at the more local level, your state legislature, even more locally down to your mayor that you might be interacting with. And I'll go through at the end of the talk some information on how to interact with policymakers for scientists. Then we have the Congressional Staffers. So for the House of Reps and the Senate, those offices each member's office has its own set of staff. And those people are really important because if you want to interact with a member of Congress, you almost always have to go through their staff. So they are like the brain of the operation. They store all the information and translate it for the congressperson. And oftentimes legislation that is introduced by that member of Congress was actually written by their staff. In addition to office staff, there's also committee staff. So members of Congress sit on committees, and the committees themselves have offices of staff to help the committee function. These people are also really important because they tend to stick around longer than office staff. They don't come and go with individual members of Congress. They also tend to be very specialized to the topic their committee is dealing with. So if it's a science committee, many of the staff will actually have PhDs. So those authorizations I mentioned before are done through committees. So you would want to have a good relationship with the committee staff if you're interested in what's happening with those authorizations. And then lastly, we have the agency administrators. So if you think of a NASA center, you might think of the engineers and scientists who work there. There's also a whole lot of administrative staff working for the agencies, and in policy, we mostly deal with those people, the administrators. Zooming in on the agencies, for NASA, we mostly deal with the Science Mission Directorate and the Office of STEM Education. The National Science Foundation, we interact a lot with the mathematical and physical sciences, within which is the astronomical sciences. Major research equipment facilities construction, so that's where all our big ground-based telescopes get constructed through. That's the budget line for that. Human resource development a little bit. There are some education programs that come through there. And then DOE, Department of Energy's Office of Science. Within that, there's the High Energy Physics Division, and within that is the Cosmic Frontier Program. So that's where we get our studies of dark matter, dark energy, neutrinos, etc. So these are the three agencies we deal with the most. We also deal a little bit with NIST, very rarely with NOAA, and sometimes with other agencies, but it's mostly these three. So now that I've given you kind of the vocab 101, I'm going to go into the budget cycle because for science policy, this is our meat and potatoes of the operation normally. This would be our standard procedures to just work on advocating for funding for the sciences. The satellite constellation problem has definitely significantly eaten into the amount of time we have to do our advocacy, but budgets are still really important. So here's an overview of the federal budget process. It's a little confusing. So I'm going to start at the bottom. We have fiscal years, that's the FY, versus calendar years. So you can notice that the fiscal year does not line up with the calendar year. So the fiscal year runs from October through September. So we're actually right at the very end of fiscal year 2020, and we're about to go into fiscal year 2021. And while the fiscal year is progressing, the government is trying to figure out what it's going to do for next year. So about now, the agencies, all these blocks in blue are the agencies doing work on budgets. So the agencies should be finalizing their plan with the Office of Management and Budget. So their plan for FY 2021 already came out this past February, in February 2020. So the plan they're finalizing right now will be for fiscal year 2022. And in February, that plan will get released as the president's budget request, because the Office of Management and Budget is applying strict limits to how much the agencies can spend. So they're working with the agencies to figure out, like, basically what is the bare minimum you need to function, because they always want to present a very fiscally conservative budget coming from the president to show, like, look, he's trying to save the country money. But after the president gets their say on the budget, it goes to Congress, and Congress has the final say, and usually they end up putting a lot of the money back in. So after February, ideally, assuming it's not late for some reason, the budget gets released, and now it's Congress's turn to figure out what their plan for the country is going to be. So the first thing they need to do is figure out what is the total amount of money that they have to spend on everything. So that is the budget resolution. And then the hearings part of that orange box is they call in expert witnesses to help them make informed decisions about how they should be spending money in the government. So for science, they'll be calling in very high-ranking agency administrators. They might also call in some scientists working on big projects. And once they've decided what the total amount of money they have to spend is, then they break it up into 12 appropriations bills. So they're going to write out the full plan for our country, but divide it into 12 pieces. And you'll see why they need to divide it into 12 pieces, because the subcommittee that has science is, so the one that deals with the appropriations bill that contains all of science is the Commerce, Justice, Science, Appropriations Subcommittee. So one of those 12 bills contains all of commerce, all of justice, and all of science. So they have a truly enormous task in front of them, which is why this is usually where we get delays in the budget. So when I say there's 12 appropriations bills, there's 12 on the House side, 12 on the Senate side that are identical, and then they have to come to an agreement and pass the final 12. So usually the House goes first and publishes their 12 ideas, and then the Senate takes their turn to publish their 12 ideas. That's where we're stuck right now. We've heard from all 12 subcommittees on the House side. We haven't heard anything from the Senate so far. And then after the Senate says what their idea is, then the House and Senate have to come to an agreement on what the final numbers should be. And that also takes a significant amount of time. That's usually where we get stuck. And then once they've come to an agreement, they send this complete package of all 12 appropriations bills to the president's desk for them to sign into law. And while all of that I've just gone through is happening this whole time, the agencies are already working on the following year's budget. So they're pretty much always working on at least 3 budgets at one time. They're enacting the current year's budget, and they're having to work on the next 2 years out, because even after they handed off FY 2021 in the president's budget request went to Congress, they know Congress is going to change it quite a bit. So every time they hear from Congress, like when the House published their numbers, they have to start thinking, okay, this is different than what we planned for. So what changes are we going to make to accommodate for that? So I said that we were stuck. What that means is we're going to need to pass a continuing resolution because we're at the end of FY 2020 and we don't know what we're doing for FY 2021. A continuing resolution means we're just going to keep everything the same from 2020 until we figure out what we're doing for 2021. It's not ideal because it doesn't keep up with inflation and it doesn't allow for new funding for new projects, but it is much better than the alternative, which is the government shutdown. And I think a lot of people here are very familiar with the shutdown from a couple years ago that overlapped with the AAS winter meeting, and it was just chaos. So we definitely want to avoid that at all costs. Now, not all of this money that Congress has to spend is going to go for science. First of all, it gets broken down into mandatory versus discretionary. Mandatory spending, Congress doesn't really get to make any adjustments to that. It just is because of the mathematical projections. So that money they can't touch. So all the money they would dedicate to science is going to come out of this discretionary spending line. And here you can see as a fraction of our GDP, it's been going down, but in total dollar amounts, it's been going up. So there's some debate over whether it's a bad sign that our money that's available for discretionary spending has been going down. And it's really important that we get funding from the government for science because they fund a very big piece of the pie when it comes to basic research in the US. So the darker color, the blue color, represents how much of each category is funded federally. So for basic research, they definitely have the largest section. They also take up a pretty good chunk of the applied research category. So if we weren't getting science funding from the US government, it would be pretty catastrophic, especially to the astronomical sciences where a lot of what we do is basic research. And then if you look at, okay, all that money that's going into research and development from the government, where is that going in terms of different types of science? About half of it goes to health, and then all the other sciences get to fight over the remaining half. Space usually comes out as the next biggest category. And then from that, it's divvied up among all the remaining sciences. So I'm going to show you some examples of those budget process numbers. These are going to be for FY20 because we only have the president's budget request and the House request for 2021. So I'll show that at the end, but it's better to have the president's, House, Senate, and final numbers to illustrate what happens. So here's NASA's budget, NASA's science budget for the current year, fiscal year 20. We're on the last day of fiscal year 20. You can see here in yellow that the president's budget request asks for across the board cuts. And then as soon as it goes to the House, which is the first phase of Congress looking at it, then they give the money back in most cases. And then the Senate numbers usually aren't the same as the House numbers. So when they go to come up with the final numbers, that's called conferencing, there's some negotiating that's happening. And you'll see if you look at, take astrophysics, for example, it wasn't necessarily that they just picked the 15% of the House, or they just picked the 7% of the Senate, or that they took the average. They did some kind of negotiating so that across the board in all these categories, the numbers, it's not obvious how they came to those decisions. And so for the NSF is special because it has this major research equipment and facilities construction line. which does not act the same as other budget lines. So normally you would want slow and steady increases year after year, keeping slightly ahead of inflation. MREFC, however, they just fund projects as they're happening. So if a project is ending and they don't have a new one that's on the rise, then the budget line just goes down and they'll just dramatically increase it as another project picks up. So that one has a significantly more variation in it than most other budget lines. So here we see that across the board, everyone agreed this line should be cut, because historically it's okay for this line to be cut because they get the money back later. It's not guaranteed they'll get the money back later, but that is historically how things have gone. And then here we have some numbers for DOE's Office of Science. Once again, President taketh, Congress giveth back. So for FY21, all we have are the president's numbers and the House numbers. We see a lot of cuts from the president's request, but instead of seeing increases for the House request, it's flat. And this is because of COVID-19 and the fact that they've already given money and they know they're going to be doing future stimulus bills. So knowing that we're going to be spending a lot of money on COVID relief, they have decided to just leave the overall budget flat from 2020. So now I'm going to talk about what are some of the motivators for why they fund things or don't fund things, and if what we do as scientists has any kind of impact on that. And I'm going to start with public opinion, because elected officials care about what their constituents think. And those missions and facilities and grants and operations and infrastructure that we as scientists use are funded by agencies. I just went through how agencies get their money. All of that pot of money that Congress has to work with came from taxes. So it is the public support and taxpayer money that is trickling through the appropriations cycle and resulting in all the things that we rely on the government for as scientists. So it's really important for us in the scientific community to engage in outreach to provide education and job opportunities to the public so that they like us, because that will result in congressional support. And I have a specific example from my experience on the Hill in my current position. I was visiting with a representative's office in Florida, and his district did not have a NASA center in it, but was next to a district with a NASA center. And his district did have a manufacturing facility that the products they produce were mostly used by that NASA center. So that NASA center was not in his district, but it was providing jobs in his district. And so he consistently always voted to support NASA as much as possible when voting in Congress. So the good news is science is a really easy thing policy-wise. It's not controversial. People generally like it, and especially with science that has to do with space, it's even more easy. People really like space. So here I have some poll results showing that despite the fake news crisis, public confidence in scientists is still increasing. The public feels that conducting basic scientific research to increase our knowledge of space is a priority. And they also consistently approve of NASA, which is to them, they equate that in their minds with scientists who study space. So that's all great. More importantly, I think, are these poll results that show the public believes that scientists should be engaging with elected officials and the public, and that public policy should be based on science. So I think those are the two most important results from this set of polls. That does end up translating into the public does support funding for basic science. but I really feel like the engagement and interaction with policy is very important. So I have this list here of, we just saw how science was polling with the public. How is that translating to its polling in government? The good news is that the current Congress, which is ending soon, the 116th Congress, the science committees, if you watch their briefings and hearings on C-SPAN, you will see quite clearly that there's very strong bipartisan support for science. And the current Congress overall, not even on the science committees, is very supportive of STEM education, at the very least, as a means to create the next generation of workers. There's also been a major shift in attitude towards climate change in Congress, not speaking for the administration, but in Congress there has been. If you read an article that's more than a year or two old about a member of Congress and their feelings on science and climate change, I would disregard it and try to find a more recent article, because it's a lot of the previous climate deniers now accept climate change as real. And the question is, what's causing it and what do we do about it? Which I personally think is fine that they want to argue over that, because at least now we can have a conversation. Interesting thing with this administration that the science advocacy world has been having to deal with is that the priorities keep shifting. So normally all presidential administrations release an annual list of their science priorities. And while we still read that for this administration, we don't give it as much weight because the priorities could change in 2 weeks. So it's just a little too chaotic at the moment for us to put much weight in those. An example is Trump kind of flip-flopping between whether he wants to prioritize getting to the moon versus just going straight to Mars. And so Vice President Pence has kind of taken over that initiative because he definitely has his sights set on the moon. And so he's kind of guiding that for the administration. And also that's something that's different with this administration is those cuts I was showing before are a fair bit deeper than previous administrations, which means that when Congress goes to do their budgets, they have a much bigger difference between the congressional budgets and the administration budgets. So you will hear in appropriations hearings that you will hear members of Congress complaining about the fact that they feel like they basically have to start over and the agencies just have to go with the president's budget request. So when they ask the agencies what they want, the agencies are still telling them these low numbers, even though Congress knows that's costing them major programs that Congress wants to see happen. So that's a little messy right now as well. Congress passing a continuing resolution to avoid a government shutdown is very relevant for the sciences. We need the agencies to keep functioning. Unfortunately, COVID relief is stalled. There's a new attempt at some compromise, but no one in DC is very hopeful about that. Independent of a big COVID bill, but could be incorporated into it, is the RISE Act. So this would provide $26 billion to US science agencies, mostly with the intent of helping early career researchers not drop out of the field during COVID. So it's a COVID relief package just aimed at scientific research enterprise with the intent of helping early career researchers. So that could possibly pass on its own. It does have a lot of bipartisan support. But yeah, if you try to talk about science when you're visiting the Hill, it is difficult because COVID-19 is pretty much pushing out all other priorities. If we zoom in on space policy, which doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as science policy, Right now, there is a lot of interest in space, but it's mostly because of commercial and military prospects and less so science. Human exploration is definitely dominating the conversation. The last version of the NASA reauthorization that came out was from the House, and pretty much all of the attention in the coverage of that announcement what had to do with human exploration and not so much the science. Space Command, Space Force, and Space Commerce are here, and they're very likely to stay. It's very unlikely that when the administration changes, whenever that is, that a new administration would get rid of them. In fact, because of the rapid commercialization of space we're seeing right now, and FCC being behind on their regulation, it's looking like the Office of Space Commerce is going to be very much needed as another way for the government to interact with the space industry. Because regulation is falling behind, there is a good amount of movement to overhaul space regulation in the US and at the international level. And this isn't just coming from the astronomy community because of satellite constellations. I'm actually hearing about this a lot in space law symposiums and space satellite industry workshops. So the industry itself recognizes they're coming up on a problem. They're mostly thinking of space debris, but if regulation is going to get overhauled, this is an opening for the scientific community to provide input on future regulation. So overall, science and engineering, we're very lucky. People generally like us, including members of Congress. And that means that the only reason that we would lack support is other priorities ranking higher. So that is obvious in the House numbers for 2021. Because of COVID, they're just leaving everything flat. They're not going to increase any budgets. And it's not because they don't like science, it's because of COVID. So if you do get the chance to interact with your representatives or senators, something to keep in mind is that while there is a sharp divide economically along pretty much every other thing that they could be voting on, there is a pretty smooth distribution in each party, and that's true in the House and in the Senate. So I'm going to get into kind of the advocacy stuff a bit more right now, and what you can do to get involved in the resources that the AAS provides you. So our role, like I said at the beginning of the talk, two-way communication. So informing policymakers on the status of the astronomical sciences, what is the cool, fun science that's happening that makes them like science more. And then also informing our community about federal policy and developments that might impact our ability to do science. On the government-facing side, we can take that informing to the next level and do advocacy and also get into some lobbying by approaching the government with the intention to ask for something. So kind of a bridge from informing to advocacy has been with satellite constellations. We've been meeting with congressional staffers, and we're getting called in to inform them on the situation because they really only have been hearing from industry. So we're giving the scientist side. And at the same time, we're obviously advocating for protecting astronomical observatories from interference by satellite constellations. And then on the community-facing side, some of the more important items that we deal with, especially if they're aimed at improving the state of the profession, might not just come due as like a blog post on the policy blog, but will actually be a board resolution or statement, in which case it's still our job to make sure everyone's informed about those. So a bit on that difference between lobbying and advocacy. If you're a lobbyist, you go in and you make demands, whereas an advocate provides information with the expectation you're going to get questions through which you can make your demands. And usually the people you're meeting with understand that's why you're there. So the few times that we do lobbying generally have to do with appropriations, where we basically write a letter that says, you should give the NSF $9 billion and here's why. And we do that all right around one time of year when everyone else is doing their appropriations work. So if you're a private citizen, you cannot be a lobbyist. If you are a Fed, if you're a federal employee, and definitely make sure of this before you talk to anyone, then there are pretty big restrictions on what you can and cannot say to certain people in government. But if you're just a student on a fellowship or something, then you don't have to worry about being a lobbyist. You are free to go in and talk to your representatives and directly demand things of them. I work on this project and you should fund it because I'm your constituent and I work on it. So it's important for us in advocacy to gather community input so that we're correctly representing the community's interests. The biggest thing is the decadal surveys, setting the priorities of the fields for the next 10 years. So the astronomy and astrophysics decadal is supposed to be wrapping up soon, although COVID is delaying that. The planetary science decadal is just getting started, which COVID has also delayed that. And the heliophysics decadal is, they actually just had their mid-decadal, which is a relatively new thing. No priority changes can happen at the mid-decadals. It's just meant to be an assessment of the progress made on the current decadal. So basically the decadals are super important because if anything gets mentioned in them as a priority, that is like your gold seal of approval, like to tell Congress, you have to do this because the decadal said so. So we rely pretty heavily on the decadal prioritizing things in science advocacy. We also have advisory committees. So these are groups of volunteers from the community who advise the agencies. So they are like the live feed updates for the agencies on what is happening. They have public meetings. So if you're curious about advisory committees, you can email me after this and I can send you a list and you can look up when their next meetings are and listen in and maybe consider volunteering for one sometime in the future. A little bit less official is the Committee on Astronomy and Public Policy, which is a AAS committee. We don't have public meetings, but it's basically made up of AAS members. And anytime AAS Public Policy Department, so myself or my boss, want to submit a letter to Congress or the administration, we always have to run it by CAP and get it approved by the president of the AAS, who also sits on CAP. So if you were to volunteer for that committee, you would get to see a lot of the basic workings of what's happening with AAS public policy. And recently, we've also taken on the responsibility of doing the COVID survey for the AAS to measure the impact that COVID has had on the community. We did the first one back in May. We wanted to issue the second one in August, but we're a little behind. It should be getting issued this week, actually. So please keep an eye out for that. And then we offer congressional visits days. So this is an opportunity for you to kind of cut us out as the middleman and just speak to your representatives directly. But if you're nervous about doing that, you've never done it before, Congressional Visits Days, we give you training on how to go about visiting with your officials and policymakers, and then we bring you to the Hill to do that. So our job in the Public Policy Department, all that communicating involves meeting with Hill staff, so those congressional staffers, whether they're in offices or on committees, meeting with the administration, so the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Office of Management and Budget, meeting with those agency admins, and then also attending the advisory committee meetings so that we're up to date on what the community is telling the agencies, and we also get to see the agency's response during those meetings. Monitoring the decadal surveys, so now I believe this week, the planetary decadal is going to start meeting. So we'll also be monitoring that as well from now on. Managing challenges like satellite constellations has taken up a very big chunk of our time, because it turns out that we haven't really had to interact with the satellite industry before. So we've had to do all the training on how to do that properly so we don't sound like fools and make demands that they'd never meet, so we can actually get some progress. Attending coalition meetings and submitting letters. So coalitions are when groups of scientific societies come together and we submit letters as one body. So if you're in Congress and you get a letter from one of these coalitions, it's basically all of science in the US agreeing on this one thing and telling you about it. So that's very impactful. It's important to join coalitions. We also attend hearings and we submit written testimony. So some examples of those coalitions: the Task Force on American Innovation. This is kind of like the science crossover with industry coalition. Coalition for Aerospace and Science, that's the NASA coalition. Coalition for the NSF is very literal. The Publishing Coalition is the opposite in that their acronym does not indicate at all what they do, so we just call them GATF. And then the Energy Sciences Coalition is for DOE Office of Science. So current events that are dominating the discussions we're having right now: the decadals, satellite constellations, space weather. Some good news: the Pro-SWIFT Act, a piece of legislation setting out a national plan to do a better job at space weather forecasting, actually made it out of Congress right now, which is crazy because there's a pandemic and an election and all this stuff happening, so no legislation should be able to make it out, but this piece did. So that's really exciting. We're just waiting for the president to sign it into law now. But COVID-19 is really just dominating the discussion in every way. So things that we offer you: Congressional Visits Day, which I already mentioned. We also have a policy blog if you want to stay up to date on things that are happening. We make sure that we coordinate between the divisions, so the divisions are allowed to advocate for themselves, but anytime a letter is coming officially from the AAS as a whole, we need to treat all the divisions the same. And that mostly comes up during appropriations and talking about budgets. Advisory committees, monitoring what's happening on those and occasionally mentioning important things that might be happening in those on policy blogs. We also, part of the policy blog is to post upcoming events. So we would post upcoming advisory committee meetings on there. And if you want to do a local visit with your officials, not right now because pandemic, but afterwards, we can help you organize that. So if you are interested in engaging with the political process, in-person visits are always the best, but are not available right now because of the pandemic. So phone calls and emails would normally be pretty significantly in second place, but right now, because no one's having in-person visits to pay attention to, phone calls and emails are getting a lot more attention from congressional offices. So they're very effective right now. If you do decide to call or email, make sure you keep it positive and have a very clear message. And if you're unsure of how to go about doing these things, then you should volunteer for Congressional Visits Day because we train you on that. And in case you're wondering if this will even make any kind of difference, the answer is yes. Unless your member or senator has already arrived at a firm decision, you speaking to them as their constituent does have a significant impact. So the Massachusetts senators are Senator Ed Markey and Senator Elizabeth Warren. It is worth noting that Senator Markey is on the Committee of Energy and Commerce. So if you do anything related to Department of Energy's Office of Science, you might want to consider reaching out to him about supporting that, although he's already a big supporter. So be kind of preaching to the choir, but they still like to hear from people. Now, your campus does sit on a line between two districts. So I just decided, depending on which side of campus you live on, or what part of Cambridge you live on, you might be in District 5 or District 7. So I've just put up both of your representatives. But if you just Google find my rep and enter the zip code of your home address, that'll tell you what district you're in and who your representative is. So if you do get the chance to meet with your representatives or senators, do no harm. Don't throw other science or projects under the bus to make yours look better. Don't mention anything partisan. Even if you're a Democrat meeting with a Democrat or a Republican meeting with a Republican, just don't mention it at all. And also make sure you're always very thankful for their past support. So look them up ahead of time and see if they've signed on to any bills or voted on any legislation that benefited the sciences, and thank them for that. And I'm just going to end on this advertisement for Congressional Visits Day. Again, if you're nervous about doing any of this, we walk you through it step by step. Right now, because of the pandemic, we're having to do virtual Congressional Visits Day. It's obviously not the same as visiting in person, but it'll still provide you the training, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to visit in person once the pandemic's over. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. We'll take questions now. And you can either raise your hand here to ask a question or put it in the chat or ask it in the Slack channel as well. Mila?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the talk. It was super helpful. My first question is, so I'm not a green card holder, and but I am like a resident for tax purposes because I've been in New England for like 10 years. So and I know there's a lot of us at the CFA who are in similar positions. How much of what you've mentioned is something we're allowed to do?
Right. The things organized through the American Astronomical Society you can still do. And you can still request to meet with the representatives or senators you're paying taxes into the area that they're representing. But you need to be upfront with them that you're not a voting constituent necessarily, but you can still present yourself as an example of science that's happening in their district or state, and the positive effect that having international collaborators brings, and things like that.
Thank you. And then the other question I had was, you emphasized the importance of public support and how this comes a lot from outreach and job creation, and yet at institutions we're often not incentivized to spend a lot of effort on these things. So did you have any ideas, or does the AAS have any ideas about how to potentially change that?
So CAP has been considering different forms of incentives. I wish CAP met more frequently. Right now they only meet about once every 3 months. I think if we met monthly, there would be a lot more movement on things like creating awards for these efforts. But it is on our to-do list to incentivize that type of labor as a society, yeah. Especially right now, when during the pandemic, the differences in the division of labor are just that much more obvious. I think we're gonna see a shift in culture motivated a lot by what's happening right now in the pandemic, because it's making it more obvious to a lot of people.
Thank you. What's CAP again?
CAP is the Committee on Astronomy and Public Policy. That's a AAS committee. So during the summer meetings of the AAS is when we do the shuffling of members for committees.
Thank you so much.
you. Other questions? Well, if nobody else has any, I have a couple. I don't see any other hands in the meantime. So I was going to say, first of all, it was really nice to see those poll results showing that, you know, despite whatever misinformation might be or going around, that people still have high trust in science.
Yeah.
I just wanted to check. So those polls were done, like, I'm assuming they weren't targeted. Did they like try to reach every demographic
Right.
in the US?
Yeah, I can go back to who conducted them and when. So Pew Research Center definitely wouldn't have targeted polls. That would try to be as general as possible. It is US adults that's the level of targeting that they did. Research for America also intentionally doesn't want to target their polls at all. Part of their function as a nonprofit is to constantly kind of get the pulse of where America is at and how they see science. So given that that's like one of their goals as a nonprofit organization, they definitely wouldn't want to skew this at all.
It's really good to see that this stretches across the board. Thank you. We have another question, Jonathan McDowell.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that poll thing. I was struck by the increase in support one over the years, but I'm wondering how long that's been going on for. You maybe don't go back, but I'm imagining that support for science, trust in science, was higher in like the 1960s, and there was at some point, you know, there was a nadir, and I'm wondering if you have any idea when that was.
That's a great question. And now I really want to go back and look up the previous iterations of this poll and kind of paste them all together and see what it says. So I'm definitely going to look into that.
Anna Rosen.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for this talk. How do you think so obviously COVID and the pandemic has changed a lot of things and also created a lot of debt. How do you have any idea or any thoughts on like how this is going to change? How this pandemic might change the funding of like astronomy and other fields?
So we're already seeing some changes in the agencies restructuring when they issue calls for proposals for RNA grants and how long those last for. So NASA's already done some shuffling around. I think what we're gonna see is like a several year ripple where we've had some immediate adjustments for during the pandemic, and then we're gonna need to, once the pandemic has ended, we're gonna need to figure out like, do we actually like this new way of doing things, or do we wanna go back to the old way? And so there's gonna be kind of like a tail ripple effect from these changes. But assuming the pandemic ends in the next year, I don't know if we're going to see decades-long changes unless some of these new methods really appeal to a lot of people. So one of the changes, I think this was actually done by NSF, was to get rid of deadlines for certain proposals and to just accept applications as they come in. So would the scientific community actually like that, or would they actually find that more stressful? Like, do people even though it's very stressful right around the deadline, do people actually prefer to have a set deadline that they can plan around? We're not sure. We're going to need a few years to figure that out. So I think there's definitely going to be some changes in how scientists get funded through grants. From the academic side, it's still too early to tell, but I don't have a good feeling based on the results we got from the first poll, which was way back in May. And we're really curious about what's going to happen with the second poll. So what happened with the first survey we did, it was supposed to be CAP issuing a COVID impact survey to inform CAP decisions about policy stuff for the AAS and what we would advocate for with respect to COVID relief. Other committees within the AAS also wanted to do some kind of COVID impact survey. So we actually ended up forming a separate task force to deal with this survey that also includes the Employment Committee, the Publications Committee. So the second survey that's going out is significantly longer than the first survey and will include more questions about what's happening with employment from the employer's perspective and from the employee's perspective, whether people have lost work, how much financial aid people are requesting, what people feel about the grant extensions and those cost extensions. We're going to cover that a lot more thoroughly in the second survey.
All right, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions, and we have passed the time that the seminar is set for, so we don't want to encroach on anybody's time. If you do still want to talk to our speaker, the speaker schedule still has several open slots. Last I looked right before the seminar. So thank you all for coming, and once again, thank you, Kelsie, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you for inviting me. And I will say, if you're early career or any stage of your career and interested in getting involved in science policy, just shoot me an email, because at any level that you want to get involved, I have a lot of advice.
Thank you.
Thank you.